All right, welcome to the Spotlight session. We're going to start with Sikini, talking about advances in learning Bayesian networks of bounded Treewidth.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sikini from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and this is a joint work with Dr. Maua, Dr. Campos, and Professor Chen. And in this work, we studied the problem of score-based Bayesian network structure learning with a hard constraint on the tree width. And we present two approaches to solve this problem. The first one is based on mixed integer linear programming, in which we combine the MILP formulation for unconstrained Bayesian network structure learning with the MILP formulation for computing the tree width in an undirected graph. So linear relaxation is used to solve the problem, which means our algorithm is an anytime algorithm. Given enough time, it will return the optimal solution. And if a time limit is set, it can return an approximate solution with an arrow bound to the optimal solution. And this integer formulation works well with small data sets. To scale up to larger domains, we present our second approach, which is based on uniformly sampling k-trees. A k-tree is the maximal graph with a tree width k, which means no more edges can be added without increasing its tree width. To efficiently sampling a k-tree, we take advantage of the bijective mapping between k-tree and the so-called dandelion codes. Here is an example of the dandelion code and its corresponding 3-tree with 9 nodes. The dandelion codes can be sampled uniformly with a trivial algorithm, and it takes linear time to decoding a dandelion code into a k-tree. So given a k-tree, we first transfer it into a clique tree. Within each clique, we sample a topological order to recover its local structures. And by combining all the local structures, we're able to recover the global structure of the Bayesian network. Here is some experiment results. The first table shows the running time of our linear integer programming algorithm compared with other methods. It suggests that our algorithm is often faster. And the second table shows the BDU scores achieved by different methods. It suggested that our sampling method can often return close to optimal solution, and it works well with larger data sets. For more information, please come to our poster number 44. Thank you.
Up next, we have Daniel Huang talking about data parallel probabilistic modeling.
Okay, so this is joint work with my collaborators at Oracle Labs, John Baptiste Tristan, Adam Pocock, Stephen Green, and Guy Steele, and also Joseph Tassarotti from CMU. So the goal of this work is like that of probabilistic programming, and we just want to make it easier to apply Bayesian machine learning. And the way we do this is we let you write a probabilistic model as a program, and then we automatically transform this into an inference algorithm. So in our case, we extract a single chain data parallel MCMC and run it on a GPU. And the point of running it on a GPU is to hopefully improve the performance of the inference algorithm. So realistically, we can't expect to generate efficient code for every model. So instead, we focused on fixed structure parametric models. And so given this restriction, the first attempt might be just to build the graph and sample it at runtime. But because we're on a GPU and it's a non-conventional architecture, this would probably have pretty bad performance. So instead, we have to analyze the model at compile time to discover things like conjugacy relations and conditional independence. And once we have this information, then we actually have a chance of generating code that will run efficiently on a GPU. So just to give you a flavor of how this works in practice, we ran it on a few models. So for models like LDA, where the number of latent variables scales with the size of the data, it turns out to work pretty well. So I should point out in this case that we actually generate an uncollapsed Gibbs sampler instead of a collapsed one. And this is because collapsing sequentializes the algorithm. And we're running on a GPU, which requires a lot of parallelism to be effective. So by not collapsing, we can leverage this parallelism. But the trade-off is that we've increased the mixing time. But it may be the case that there's enough parallelism in the model such that we can overcome the slower mixing time. And so we actually found experimentally that our uncollapsed sampler actually converged faster than the collapsed one, even though I had to draw many more samples. Unfortunately, there are some cases where a compiler doesn't do quite as well, and this is a linear regression where because we're analyzing the model at compile time, we can't discover enough mathematical facts due to the incompleteness of our static analysis. So in this case, we can't generate that good of a sampler. So if any of this sounded interesting to you, please stop by our poster. We'd love to chat more about it. Thanks.
Up next, we have Ruozzi talking about making pairwise binary graphical models attractive.
Hi, so this is joint work with Tony Jebara as part of the Data Science Institute at Columbia University. So the motivation for this work was, just like Adrian, we're studying this approximate marginal inference problem. So given a graphical model, we'd like to approximate the normalizing constant of the partition function. So this is an intractable problem in general. So what people often do, as Adrian suggested, right, is run belief propagation or something similar. And in practice, it really gives decent answers. But in practice, it also doesn't really converge very frequently. And this seems to be one of the biggest issues with actually using it. In recent years, one of the proposed ways to get around this is so-called convergent message passing schemes. So you may have heard of something like tree-weighted belief propagation. And these algorithms guarantee convergence if you do a certain message updating schedule, but they also produce much poorer estimates of the partition function. So the motivation for this work was, can we do, hopefully in some sense, better? Can we design message passing algorithms that converge more quickly, but also do at least provably better than the tree-weighted algorithms? So as the title of this paper suggests, it's all about making pairwise binary graphical models more attractive. So what does that mean? Coarsely, that means we take a network that has so-called frustrated cycles, so cycles that have a negative, an odd number of repulsive edges in them. So these graphs tend to be the difficult graphs to run belief propagation on. And we construct a new graph in which there are no such frustrated cycles. And this construction relies only on looking at sort of the local interactions. So it's very easy to do. In fact, for those of you familiar with it, it's sort of like a generalization of the QPBO algorithm in computer vision. And what we do then is we run belief propagation actually on this new graph, and we find that it's significantly faster in terms of convergence than regular BP on the original problem. And not only that, but it converges much more frequently as well. So some experimental results here very briefly show that this BP on this new construction converges nearly 100% of the time for most of the things we were looking at. So these are like grid graphs, some subsets of this e-pinions data network, some networks that resemble deep belief networks. And yeah, so the take-home message is this new proposal converges faster, and we can actually prove that in many instances it actually gets better results. So come see our poster. Thanks.
Thank you. I now find these models a little bit more sexy. Up next is Chen talking about mode estimation for high-dimensional discrete tree graphical models.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chen from Rutgers University. This is a joint work with Han Liu, Dmitry Metaxas, and Tenqi Zhao. So our main goal is to compute modes of a graphical model. Modes are defined as local maximums, and our domain is generally a discrete domain. So we have d dimension, and for each dimension, we have a set of discrete values. So to define modes, we first have to define the neighborhood. We use hummingbirds centered at the element with radius delta as a neighborhood. And then we can define a mode as an element which has bigger probability than everyone else in his neighborhood. So in the center of the figure, we show illustration where each bar is one element and the height is probability. Here we can see when delta is equal to 1, we only have 3 modes in this distribution, highlighted with red color. And we can see if we use smaller delta, we will have more modes, and we will have bigger delta, we will have less modes. So overall, we are hoping to compute all the modes with all different deltas so that we can have a multi-scale view of the distribution, as we show in the bottom of the slide. So, of course, this problem is challenging. First of all, the domain is exponential. Secondly, even each neighborhood, the hummingbird itself has exponential size. So what do we do? Our solution is use tree-structured graphical model. We first estimate a tree-structured graphical model based on the given samples. Second, we develop an algorithm that computes modes of this tree. So we can prove that as we have more and more samples, our estimated modes converge to the ground truth quickly. So we apply our methods in different applications. First application is, of course, what we have hoped for, to draw all the modes at different scales so that we can give a visual illustration of what the distribution really look like. Second application, we use it in structured prediction. There, we use the set of modes as a set of predictions that have high probability, but also have naturally high diversity. And the hope is, even if the first prediction, the top probability prediction is bad, the second or third would still contain a satisfying result. Thank you.
We now have Florian Stimberg talking about Poisson process jumping between an unknown number of rates.
Hi, this is joint work with Andreas Ruttor and Manfred Opper from TU Berlin. So our main goal is to find discrete states in the firing rates of neural spiking data. So we model those spikes by coming from a Poisson process whose rate jumps between discrete states. But we don't know before it how many states there are. So to achieve this, we use Bayesian non-parametrics, namely a Chinese restaurant process. And on the left, you see in blue how such a path of the rate could look like. So we want to do Bayesian inference in this model, and we do this by using MCMC sampling, which does a random walk on the path of the firing rate. So we propose small manipulations of the path, like adding a jump, removing a jump, joining states, and so on. And luckily, the computation time of the sampler does not depend on the number of spikes in the data, but only on the number of jumps we find. So we applied the model to 10 neurons from a CATS V1 area, and as a stimulus, there was a moving bar with orientations in steps of 20 degrees. So although the number of spikes between the neurons varied highly, the number of posterior states we found was very similar, usually 4. And as the stimulus was discrete, so in steps of 20 degrees, we hoped to find discrete states in the response as well. And as you see on the left, we did. The highest firing rates normally were concentrated around a preferred orientation, and the same orientation rotated by 180 degrees. The second highest rate was normally concentrated around neighboring orientations. The lowest firing rate was preferred between the preferred orientations. So we compared our method to models which assume a continuous firing rate and found that we were better able to capture both low-firing base states and high-firing bursting states. So if you're interested, come see our poster, number 61. Thank you.
We now have Shentao Li talking about randomized experimental design for causal graph discovery.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm Shentao Li from École Normale Supérieure. This is joint work with Huang Hu and Adrian Vetta from McGill University. So given n random variables, we'd like to discover the causal relations between them, assuming that these causal relations can be represented by a directed acyclic graphs where the variables are the random variables and the directed edge represents a causal relation. So classical results tells us that from just observational data, we can recover some of this yet unknown causal graph, but not necessarily all of it. So to recover the remainder of this graph, what we must do is perform controlled experiments, and in this case, we're allowed to, each experiment is on a subset of the variables. The result of this experiment tells us what variables this subset influences. So the question we're interested in is the following. What is the minimum number of experiments that we must perform to discover a causal graph? Previous results have shown that log n experiment is sufficient and actually with an actual matching lower bound. And what we're able to show is that actually a small constant times log n experiment is sufficient. How is this possible? Well, the previous lower bound applies to deterministic algorithms, and our algorithm is randomized. In fact, after applying, obtaining all information we can from observational data, the first experiment we perform with our algorithm is a random experiment where each variable is selected with probability 1/2. Then after applying classical inference rules to deduce all the edges that we can from this experiment, what we do is, among the remainder of the graph, we must compute the largest remaining clique. So observational data usually provides us with all the undirected edges, but not all of their directions. So here, for the remaining edges, we compute the largest clique that remains. And if the size of that clique, W, is less than a constant times log n, then we just apply the previous algorithm, and it will terminate in small constant times log n experiments. Otherwise, we restart, and we can show that with high probability, we never need to restart. And thus, the number of times we must execute this loop decays exponentially. Then we also show that there's a matching lower bound for randomized experiments, for a randomized algorithm, sorry. And we turn to the average non-adversarial case. So in this case, we show that in the Erdős-Csernyi graph model, a constant number of experiments is actually sufficient to discover an unknown causal graph. So please come to our session at number 40.
Thanks. Okay, to finalize this session, we're going to have Elias Bareinboim talking about transportability from multiple environments with limited experiments.
Thank you. This is joint work with Hilda Pro. The research problem, I will talk today about transportability, and the research problem that we are interested in is the following. Assume that we conduct a perfect randomized clinical trial in Los Angeles, and we are able to estimate the effect of a certain policy or certain treatment in the outcome. It could be a new drug to cancer, and the outcome could be survival after 5 years of taking the drug. We'll be following the protocol of the FDA that uses randomization a la Fisher. These experiments are usually expensive and cost dozens of millions of dollars, but still, we are happy that we are able to get this distribution in LA and know the effect of the drug on the survival. Now, assume that we would like to get the same sort of result in New York, but Mayor Bloomberg passed some legislation in the past that he doesn't allow his population to be submitted to this kind of potentially harmful kind of treatment. The challenge that is posed to us is how to reuse the experimental knowledge that we have in LA to make similar kind of claim in New York. It's obvious that if the two populations, LA and New York, are arbitrarily different or far apart, nothing can be inferred from one to another. More tricky issue, suppose we conduct experiments on mice, and I would like to learn something about human beings. Underlining that, there is under what conditions can you transport some experimental knowledge. It's obvious that some sort of formal language is needed to encode the instances of this problem that we call transportability. Transportability generalizes different settings encountered in the literature, for example, external validity, meta-analysis, and heterogeneity that is known in the social and health science and in statistics, and also domain adaptation and transfer learning of causal knowledge in machine learning. The kind of flavor of the results that you have is the following. You have the first formal theory establishing the boundaries, is a if and only if, correct, of when and how causal knowledge can be transported across settings or populations. The new results specific in this paper is that we are handling when you have multiple heterogeneous domains and you have different kind of experimental information across this in these domains. The results have syntactical and graphical conditions. You have polynomial time algorithm to decide transportability, and our treatment is complete and non-parametric or fully non-parametric characterization of transportability. Transportability is a decision problem. For the positive instance, yes instances, this means that is estimable. Then the procedure that I just mentioned can help us to fuse the fragments of experimental data spread throughout these domains in order to synthesize the consistent estimate of the query. For the unfortunate negative instances, not estimable, is some sort of universal claim that says, a theoretical guarantee that says no other algorithm can do better. If you are curious about transportability, stop by and to discuss about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes the session for Spotlights. Now we're going to give prizes for the Outstanding Reviewer Award.
Yeah, just to let you know, we said it before, these are the 20 outstanding reviewers for this year's NIPS conference. Thank you again. And we have small checks for all of you if you are in the audience. Otherwise, we're going to mail it to you. See you again at 11.